Hello, welcome to this module on internal validity, which will focus on the extent to which we can establish a causal relationship between a dependent variable and either a set of independent variables or an individual independent variable. So the terms internal validity refer to the extent to which we can establish a causal relationship between two variables, which I'll refer to as A and B. And causal relationships, unlike correlational relationships, typically require a stronger basis of evidence. Namely, one, that the cause, let's say it's A, preceded B in time. Two, A co-varies with B, so it's changing with B. And three, and more importantly, there is no other explanation for the relationship between A and B that is plausible. Causal inference is always about a comparison, whether it is between A and not A, or A and an alternative cause. In many applications, causal inferences and causal validity are local in the sense that the conclusions are limited to the context of a particular treatment, particular outcome, setting, time, or individuals that are studied. Now, in practice, there are several threats to internal validity, which have become the source of a lot of ongoing research in causality, specifically in non-experimental settings. The key stipulation for internal validity is that all other explanations, which was the third point that I pointed out, are ruled out, namely that other possible causes should be eliminated from consideration. The most common threats to internal validity that are related to this stipulation are: one, that there's ambiguous temporal precedence; selection into treatment, which is actually the most common threat to internal validity; history; maturation; regression; attrition; and testing, and instrumentation. So starting with the first one, which is referring to ambiguous temporal precedence. This is referring to the situation in which it is unclear about which variable occurred first, either A or B. And because of this confusion, this raises doubts about whether A, for example, is the actual cause, or whether it is possible that A could be the effect. And this poses a threat to internal validity because when the cause is unknown, it precludes the use of experimentation or studies that center on manipulating the cause. So in particular, if we're unsure whether A or B is the actual cause, then we cannot really be in the situation where we can manipulate the particular cause in order to get the desired effect. Note that some causal relationships can be bidirectional, meaning they could be reciprocal. So for example, consider an interactive software program that supports students by providing support completing algebra problems. As students get familiar with the software, they may feel more confident, which can lead to successful completion of the problems and prompt students to turn to the software further. So here, this type of relationship can be referred to as a reciprocal causal relationship, in which the software was originally designed to support students, but in the process it actually motivating them to continue using it further because of the boost in confidence that the students may feel as they're completing problems in the process. The second threat to internal validity refers to selection. And as I said, this is the most common threat to validity in practice, where in many studies, individuals receiving one treatment condition may differ systematically from individuals receiving the alternative or control condition. So in this example, these differences affect the internal validity of the conclusions of the study, as the inferences may depend on both the treatment received and any of those pre-existing systematic differences between the two groups. So for example, let's go back to the case when we are trying to assess the impacts of an interactive tutoring system that is being offered across a set of schools. And the tutoring system is an application that can be downloaded onto any computer or tablet. And students and families are encouraged to download the app on their own devices at home to access the additional tutoring services. A key question of interest is in whether the tutoring system, causally, leads to an improvement in test scores among multiple subjects. However, because some families may not own their own computers or tablets, their children may not be able to access the app, and this constitutes a systematic difference in which the accessibility to the app is already a hurdle that prevents some of the students from being able to use the app and its benefits compared to others. And additionally, this might be linked to the fact that families that do not own these devices may be facing multiple hardships that affect their children's education. So here it is unclear whether the effects of the tutoring app on children is either due to the app itself, or is it due to some of these home and accessibility differences that have nothing to do with the app altogether. And in response to this threat of selection, we want to take a moment to talk about the role of randomization. So the threats that are attributed to selection, in theory, can actually be eliminated through randomization of treatment. So when a treatment, intervention, program is randomly assigned to individuals, any bias that is due to selection can be eliminated because the process of forming these groups randomly will only lead to groups that differ by chance rather than due to systematic differences. And here, when I mention the term bias, this refers to the factors that affect the validity of the causal inferences in a study. So going back to the previous example, when I talked about the limitations due to accessibility, where some students may be able to download the app while others cannot. If, for example, all the students were able to download the app by being given a tablet, and students were randomly assigned to receive the app or not, then the process of one, giving every student the tablet already eliminates the challenges due to accessibility. And second, the process of randomizing some students to receive the app and others to not will essentially balance any of those other pre-existing differences between the students. Now, because random assignment is not always possible, methods to establish causal inference in non-experimental studies, so studies in which there is no randomization, do necessarily rely on assumptions to address the bias from selection. Another threat to internal validity is referred to as history, where this refers to events that occur between the start of the treatment and the end of the study that could have produced the effects in the absence of the treatment. So for example, in the same study on the interactive tutoring system, suppose that students using the app also received tutoring from family members during the study. And here, the problem is that the effects of the app cannot be fully isolated, as it is confounded or mixed or confused with the effects of the additional tutoring from family members. Another threat is referred to as maturation, in which when studies are conducted with individuals, many natural things or natural changes can occur that are unrelated to the treatment, but which nevertheless can still have an impact on the ultimate measurement of the collection of data responses. For example, individuals grow older, so longitudinal studies that track individuals over time have to account for the fact that individuals are growing over that time. Individuals may also grow hungrier, wiser, stronger, or more experienced, and all of these changes can affect the outcomes or the dependent variables in ways that are completely unrelated to the treatment. So in the same interactive tutoring system study, suppose now that tablets are offered to all children so that accessibility to the app is not of a concern anymore. And additionally, assume that there are two different tutoring systems that are randomized to the students, and the dependent variable is the score on an end-of-program assessment generated by the system itself. And suppose that in the process of interacting with the system, children become fatigued and disengaged as a result, especially if the children have been on the app for a lengthy period of time. It's only natural that children can become fatigued and be bored with the app, for example. And each of these instances in which the children become disengaged is an example of maturation, where the length of time that the children are using the system may be too long and lead to unintended consequences that can ultimately affect the outcome. So it's hard to concentrate when children are exhausted, for example. Another threat refers to regression, where in some studies individuals are selected to receive a treatment because they scored high or low on some measure. And this form of targeted recruitment leads to the phenomenon known as regression, in which the individuals receiving the treatment or control are similar in multiple characteristics. And in particular, it's possible that in the course of the study, the selected individuals who are chosen to receive a treatment because of high scores, for example, may score lower on subsequent assessments. This is also known as regression to the mean, where suppose that an interactive program that assigns certain problems to students who score high on the exam may find that the same students tend to score lower on subsequent problems. And so in this case, because students were essentially selected based on their high scores, their performance might not stay consistently high on all of the exams following that. And so their scores are essentially being brought to the average, which is the motivation for the phrase regression to the mean. In this example, the process of randomizing students to the different groups, so random assignment, may mitigate the effects of regression to the mean because this is a way of preemptively controlling for some of those similarities in the beginning that are due to targeted recruitment of students. Finally, moving on to attrition, which is very common in educational settings. This is referring to the situation when participants prematurely leave a study and no further outcome data is collected. Attrition is a very serious threat to internal validity when the individuals who remain in the study are very different from those who left. And these differences produce differences in the final dependent variable data that may not be due to the treatment itself. So suppose that a study was conducted assessing the impact of an interactive phonics game for elementary school students. And we find that even with randomization, there may be students who decide that the game is, let's say, too easy for them, and they choose to stop using the game compared to other students. Now, because of the early departure of these students from the study, this loss of data can affect the estimation of the impacts of the game, as students who had specific experiences with the game, namely that they found it too easy, might be different from students who continue using the game, especially if these students who stay actually need the additional time with the game to improve their phonics skills. A variation of attrition that also occurs in practice is known as differential attrition, which to some researchers is even more of a serious problem. This occurs when the number of individuals who leave the study differs between those assigned to the treatment versus those assigned to the control group. So for example, if the students who are assigned to, let's say, the phonics game compared to those who are not, the number of students that leave the game or stop using the game is different between the treatment and the control group. This is referred to as differential attrition. And unfortunately, even with random assignment itself cannot mitigate the effects of differential attrition. But it's important in these circumstances to try to get as much information as possible to understand the sources of not only differential attrition, but attrition in general, and assess what are the factors that motivate someone to stay in a study versus motivate them to leave. Moving on to testing. When individuals take a test, the experience of doing so may influence their scores when the test is administered again. Factors such as practice, familiarity, and reactivity can affect scores, and these may be independent from the treatment effect itself. The concern is that the behavior of the individuals may change when they participate in a study. So when a person is part of a study and they're given an assessment, their score on this initial assessment may be very different compared to if they're given the same assessment 5 days from now. So things like a familiarity in which the person knows the questions or knows what types of questions and knows what to expect can all influence their performance the second time by, let's say, boosting their confidence and removing some of the uncertainty that is common when you first participate in a study. When exams are given as the final assessments, students may try to memorize the topics or questions used in preparation for the following exam. And because of this, association with the topics and their familiarity present a threat to the internal validity of the study itself. One way to mitigate the effects of this is to try changing the items or the tests used so that when you are dynamically rotating the types of questions, for example, this presents an element of surprise that could counteract some of these actions to, like, let's say, familiarize or memorize the topics of an exam. Instrumentation refers to the type of internal validity threat that is particularly common in studies of child development. And this refers to changes in a measuring instrument that can occur over time, which are, again, independent of treatment, that may lead to changes in the treatment effect. So, for example, a scale that is used to assess a child's cognitive development may not have a constant meaning over the age range of interest. So, a scale that is used to measure children between the ages of 3 to 5, for example, may not capture quite the same information compared to one administered for children who are between the ages of 9 to 11. And finally, to talk about another source of threats to internal validity, this is actually a combination of multiple threats that we just talked about, in the sense that there can be additive as well as interactive effects due to, again, a combination of the prior threats. So the prior list of threats may not necessarily operate like in isolation. In a study, you can find multiple threats that happen in conjunction, and this leads to, in many cases, a bigger threat that can have a very dire effect on the estimation. So, for example, it may be common to observe both selection and maturation, in which this leads to very detrimental impacts on the bias of the estimates. And this would occur when individuals self-select into the treatment or comparison group, and the participants in the groups also mature in different rates over time. Finally, I'd like to spend some time talking about internal validity in non-experimental studies. So far, all of the threats that I have mentioned are particularly pertinent to experimental studies in which we have randomization of treatment. But as I said, selection, which was one of the biggest threats to internal validity, is quite common, especially in observational studies where we don't have randomization of treatment. And yet, nevertheless, researchers continue to be very interested in establishing causal relationships, even in the absence of randomization of treatment. So I wanted to talk about what types of approaches can still be used to ensure the internal validity of inferences from non-experimental studies where, again, we don't have randomization of treatment. And the problem is that when we don't have random assignment, ensuring the internal validity of conclusions is more difficult, as there can be threats from both measured as well as unmeasured factors. However, because establishing causality continues to be at the forefront of a lot of health and social science research, many of the threats that I'm about to describe are intended to strengthen the internal validity of inferences, in spite of the multiple sources and myriad sources of bias that can be present in a study. But one thing to be mindful of is that the methods that I'm about to discuss typically rely on various assumptions, but if they are met, they can lead to bias-reduced causal inferences. And when these causal inference methods are applied to non-experimental studies, these studies are often referred to as quasi-experimental studies. So they're quasi-experimental in the sense that the methods are trying to recover some of the same attributes that were lost from the absence of randomization. So here I want to talk about three of the most common types of causal inference approaches for non-experimental studies. And these include matching, instrumental variables, and regression discontinuity. So let's start with matching. By its name, matching is the process of constructing subgroups of participants in the treatment and control group that are similar on a variety of characteristics. Importantly, matching is most effective for bias reduction when it is used with the characteristics or the features that may be predictive of variation in the responses or dependent variables. In practice, matching can be done in various ways. The simplest approach, known as nearest neighbor matching, focuses on finding the closest individual among the control group for each participant in the treatment group. This type of matching is also known as one-to-one matching, in which we have, again, one control individual matched to one treatment individual. And the final analytic sample comprises of an equal number of treatment and control participants. Alternatively, because one-to-one matching can be challenging in terms of reducing your sample size, you can also do this type of matching through 1-to-k matching, in which multiple control individuals, so k of them, are matched to a single treatment participant. But keep in mind that there are trade-offs to both of these cases, where in the one-to-one matching, we are essentially prioritizing bias reduction by trying to develop the closest matches possible by matching one person to another person. But the trade-off is that we do lose a portion of the sample size, in which anyone that is not matched is usually omitted from the analysis. On the other hand, if we were to expand this to 1-to-k matching, this is the reverse, where we increase our retention of the sample size, but again at the cost of possibly less bias reduction, since we're allowing more individuals into the match, including some that might not be as perfect of a match compared to if we only did one-to-one. Now, matching can be done with characteristics or features directly. So if you were to match two students, for example, based on the location of their school, or based on their age, or based on their background, that's one source of matching. In many contexts, the problem is that the quality of the matches can deteriorate as we're including more and more characteristics into the matching algorithm. And additionally, researchers may decide that all of these characteristics equally matter. So there might not be a situation where the researcher can really select which features matter and determine that they all matter. So in this case, we actually have a multidimensional problem because the more variables or features that we're including into the matching algorithm, the lower the quality of the matches. So in response to this, a set of methods known as propensity scores were developed by Paul Rosenbaum and Don Rubin in 1983, in which propensity scores are univariate summaries of a set of observable characteristics or features. And an important feature of propensity scores is that they are known as balancing scores, in which whenever we match on the propensity scores, that's equivalent to matching on all of the features, all of them, that are used to estimate the propensity scores themselves. So if, for example, we wanted to match on children's age, gender, household income, and other important features of their background, we can do that using a propensity score. And the propensity score itself will be a single value that summarizes all of those characteristics and summarizes them in a very balanced way. In practice, the most common method to estimate propensity scores is using something called a logistic regression model, where let's say that you have p features, so p variables. The logistic regression model is given by the equation on the screen. Now, matching, whether it is by a single feature, multiple features, or propensity scores, allow for bias estimation of the treatment effects because it allows researchers to create comparison groups that are less systematically different. And remember that the absence of systematic differences is what we observe when we have treatment assignment that is random. So here, matching is essentially trying to bring us back to the somewhat ideal case when we have treatment randomization by addressing the bias that is due to some of those, again, systematic differences. However, just a cautionary note, it should be noted that the effectiveness of matching is limited to observable features. We can only match on the data that we have at hand. We cannot match on things that we either don't have data on or that we don't observe for whatever reason. So when the selection bias stems from unobservable features, matching may not be very effective since we cannot, again, control for things that we don't see. In addition to their role in matching, propensity scores can also be used in weighting-based approaches. And again, this type of approach is complementary to matching in the sense that it presents an alternative to getting estimates of impacts in non-experimental settings. The idea of weighting is foundational to survey sampling, in which individuals that had a small representation in the sample were given larger weights. And the goal of this weighting was to make the resulting sample look more like the population from which it was taken. So suppose, for example, that a survey was being collected, and the intent of the survey researchers was to collect responses from a representative sample from, let's say, a population in the United States. In some cases, even when we are trying to recruit a representative sample, there is a chance that the sample that we end up collecting may not be fully representative. Let's say that there are a larger proportion of male participants compared to female participants, or there's a larger proportion of participants in a certain age range compared to participants in a different age range. So in this case, one simple post-hoc way of addressing this imbalance is to give a larger weight to the individuals that we collected a small sample of, so that we can essentially balance the differences in proportion and try to make the resulting sample look more like the population that we thought it was being sourced from. So in the same idea, we can do the same thing in observational studies or quasi-experimental studies, in which we apply weights and assign them to individuals or units in the control group and make them look like the treatment group. The rationale for doing this is that when the groups are compositionally similar, so if we make the control group and the treatment group look similar to each other, then bias that's due to systematic differences can essentially be minimized, and this can strengthen the internal validity of the results. So that was matching, which again can be based on a single feature, multiple features, or the propensity score. And we can also perform weighting approaches with propensity scores as an alternative to matching. The second type of quasi-experimental method that we can use to strengthen the internal validity of inferences is known as instrumental variables. So instrumental variables are a popular causal inference approach in medical and economics contexts, in which the instrumental variable, or IV, is a variable that is strongly correlated with the treatment, but it does not have a direct relationship with a dependent variable or outcome. So an IV is essentially thought of as a variable that is practically random. Because again, in non-experimental settings, the treatment itself is no longer random. And so the idea of instrumental variables methods is to find another variable that is practically random and that is correlated or has a relationship with the variable, the treatment, that is not random. Now, because the IV is strongly is practically random and is strongly correlated with the non-random treatment assignment, the method itself leverages this correlational relationship to derive bias-reduced estimates of treatment effects. IV methods are typically applied using two-stage least squares, in which a regression model is fit between the IV or IVs and the treatment predictor. And this is used to extract predicted values of the treatment, which are then fed into a second regression model in which we are trying to estimate the outcome variable and use the predicted values from the first regression as a dependent, as part of the model with the outcome as a dependent variable. One of the most important challenges of IV methods is actually the identification of a valid IV. Because again, a valid IV has to be one that is practically random and has to be correlated with the non-random treatment. In practice, there have been several examples of IVs that have there has been consensus upon in terms of the research community agreeing that these are potential candidates for instrumental variables. One of them is based on geographical distance. So this can be a distance to an institution, to a natural resource, or to a facility. And here, one of the most common applications of distance as an IV was in a study published by Thomas D., who examined the effects of educational attainment on the propensity or probability that a student will engage in voting. Now, because educational attainment is not random, and you can think of it as the treatment in this case, in this study, the author used the distance to a two-year college as essentially a proxy or a variable that is correlated with educational attainment. And because of that correlation, we can derive estimates of what are the impacts of educational attainment on the chances of someone voting. Another example of an IV that has been used are birth cohorts. The groups of children or individuals born in a certain year or at a certain time during the year has been used as an IV in many educational settings as well. And a third example of an instrumental variable, which might seem a little bit unusual, is referred to as the treatment assignment. And I want to note that the treatment assignment here is distinct from the treatment received. So in studies with non-compliance, in which participants do not necessarily take up the treatment that they were assigned, a common IV is actually the original treatment assignment, which was random. And this is a valid IV because it is clearly correlated with the treatment received. So here, the treatment assignment is what was originally assigned, and this may be different from the treatment received, especially if you have participants who don't comply with the original assignment. So here, treatment assignment is the IV because it's correlated with the treatment received, and it was either practically, if not actually, randomized. And here we have a clear connection with the outcome variable or dependent measure. So the treatment assignment in this case represents clearly a strong potential candidate for an instrumental variable. And then finally, the last set of methods that are commonly used to derive causal relationships in the absence of randomization is referred to as regression discontinuity. So under this design, participants are assigned to a treatment or control group based on the values of an assignment variable and a certain cutoff. And the cutoff is predetermined and known. So for example, suppose that the eligibility to participate in a virtual session on scholarship programs to college was based on a student's GPA. And in particular, an invitation to the session would only be given to students with a minimum GPA of 3.0 out of 4.0. So the cutoff in this case is the minimum GPA of 3.0, and the treatment is an invitation to the session, while the control is the absence of an invitation. Just to illustrate regression discontinuity designs with a figure, here we have a representation of the type of data that we might see in this design, in which we have a cutoff variable which is associated with an assignment score on the x-axis. We have the outcome variable on the y-axis. And we have a cluster of points that are to the left and to the right of the cutoff value, which is given by the bolded vertical line. So here, the regression discontinuity design essentially assigns individuals to a treatment or comparison group based on where their values of the assignment score lie in relation to the cutoff. And that gap that you see between the treatment and the control group, or the discontinuity, is a representation of the effect or the impact of receiving the treatment based on this discontinuity design. In practice, regression discontinuity designs fall into one of several types, and this is again based on whether individuals comply or do not comply with their treatment assignment. So in the ideal setting, if we do have full compliance among all individuals, this is known as a sharp regression discontinuity, or sharp RD. And here is sharp in the sense that the cut point perfectly predicts who does and does not receive the treatment. So essentially, anyone assigned to the treatment or control receives the treatment or control, and there are no compliance concerns at all. So everyone who was assigned to treatment receives the treatment. Everyone who is assigned to control receives the control. But in many cases, we do have deviations from this design, and this leads to the quote-unquote fuzzy regression discontinuity designs. So the first type of fuzzy RD design is known as a type 1 fuzzy, in which some students who are assigned to treatment do not receive the treatment, and these students are referred to as no-shows. So here in a type 1 fuzzy design, some of the individuals who are assigned to treatment simply do not come to take it up. And this might happen if for example, in the scholarship study, where a message or invitation is assigned to students based on their GPA, it's possible that some students who are given the invitation already know about the scholarships and may not need or may not feel the need to attend these sessions, and so they do not come and show up for those sessions. So those are individuals who would constitute as no-shows. But analytically, no-shows present a challenge for estimation because they are essentially deviating from the treatment assignment. The other type of fuzzy design is known as a type 2 fuzzy, where in addition to no-shows, we also have control students, typically, who receive the treatment. And these are students that are known as crossovers. So crossovers in this case are students who are originally assigned to control, but for some reason they are able to convince, let's say, an administrator, or they are able to, let's say, sneak into the treatment group and end up receiving the treatment ultimately. Both of these types of fuzzy designs present challenges for estimation because, again, they represent deviations in compliant behavior. And more importantly, if we do not understand the reasons for these deviations, any estimates that we get from running a regression discontinuity analysis may not be fully valid, internally valid, because of this potential differences between students who are compliers and those who choose not to comply. Estimates of treatment effects from RD designs can be derived using both parametric and non-parametric methods, where parametric methods assume some sort of functional form or statistical model for the data, and they generally use all of the data in the sample since you can fit a single model that can apply to all of the data in your study. On the other hand, non-parametric methods are used more so to model a local response curve, and they generally involve specifying a radius or diameter known as a bandwidth, which essentially represents a neighborhood around the cutoff for the basis of estimation. So if you recall from the previous figure in which we have that vertical line that specifies the cutoff, a non-parametric approach requires the researcher to decide how many points along that cutoff should be included in the analysis, because the more points away from the cutoff that are included, the more bias that can potentially ensue, since individuals further away from the cutoff tend to be more different compared to individuals that are close to the cutoff. And finally, the internality of estimates of treatment effects from RD designs is strongest when considering individuals closest to the cutoff. And this is because around the cutoff, individuals that are just above or just below the cutoff are pretty much considered practically random to be there. But again, as I said, as we consider individuals farther from the cutoff, we do encounter more systematic differences among individuals between the groups. And so this actually presents the common bias-variance trade-off to estimation that is not only typical in RD designs, but also in statistical analyses in general, where the closer to the cutoff that we get, the greater the bias reduction, but the smaller the power, because we are essentially reducing the sample size. Conversely, the further away from the cutoff we get, the less bias reduction we can achieve, but at the same time, we do get a greater sample size since we're including more people. And as a result, since we have a larger sample size, we get more power.